So I'm going to talk about fitness motion recognition with Android Wear. So these wearables that we can get now. And the motivation of this is kind of, while you're doing sports, you don't necessarily want to be counting the entire time. You know, that's kind of what these wearables, that's what computers are all good for. So why are we still counting the entire time? We'd rather kind of turn off our heads and just do sports, do our exercises, and wait until the computer or the watch kind of like stops us and says, okay, you're done now. So how can we get there? So this is kind of what I'm going to be talking about. First, kind of define the scope. What do I mean by fitness motion recognition? Then say what the sensors in these devices give to us, what algorithms we should use to kind of process this data, and then at the end, finally talking about how we can do this in a battery-efficient manner. Because of course you don't want your watch dying on you when you're halfway through, because then you'll never stop. The problem scope. So there's a couple different areas in this idea of motion recognition. The first one, segmenting exercise from non-exercise. So that's the idea that you're wearing this watch all day long, and as soon as you start doing something, it says, this guy's doing sports. I need to start recognizing what's going on. And so I'm not going to talk about that. That's kind of a different problem, maybe next year. So the next idea is recognizing which exercise you're doing. So assuming that you just press start, how is it going to recognize if you're doing a jumping jack or if you're doing push-ups or sit-ups or something? And that's also a different problem and not something I'm going to talk about today. Which leaves us with these two problems. One is counting repetitions, so kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's a good problem. We can handle that. Right? It's kind of like a nice encapsulated problem. And we want it to be online. And what online means is we want it to tell us that while we're doing it. It's not like we want to record all of this data and then send it to a supercomputer and it comes back and says, you did 17 push-ups. You know, we want it to kind of say 1, 2, 3 as we're going. So that's important in the selection of the algorithm, as we'll see later on. So that's thumbs up. So which fitness motion am I talking about? You see here, running, swimming, cycling. Those are kind of sports where maybe you're used to wearing some kind of device on your wrist at this point. You know, we have these, watches with GPS that tell us how far you're going. They tell us how fast you're going. Swimming, they have the same kind of thing. Also motion recognition. And cycling, you're used to having a computer there. So that's all really cool sports. We're happy there are wearables for that, but we're not talking about it today. So this fitness motion, so in particular push-ups, jumping jacks, burpees, which is kind of this complex motion where you're jumping up in the air and then going down and doing a push-up and then jumping up and doing them. So those kind of exercises, these kind of body weight exercises is what we're focusing on today. And coincidentally, these are the same kind of body weight exercises that Freeletics focuses on. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's why I've selected these exercises in particular. So I'll only be talking about one today. I've only got 20 minutes. So next year we'll do burpees. Push-ups. Everybody knows this. You get down on the ground and you do push-ups. And anytime I say we're going to be counting, we're going to have this wearable counting how many push-ups we're doing, everybody kind of looks at me weird and says, how do you do that? Because if you think about it, there's no motion where the wearable is. Like, it's not really moving that much. So Freeletics solved this in a nice way. The actual style of a push-up for Freeletics is you kind of lift your hand at the bottom. And that has a couple benefits. One is that you're actually like unweighting like your upper body. So you're not like cheating, just doing like, these tiny motions. And it's nice for the wearable, because then we can actually count it. Because you can imagine, there's something happening with that motion. Yeah, so this is kind of our input. So how do we go from this to 10 push-ups? So there's a couple sensors that Android in general offers us. One would be the proximity sensor. Like when you get close to it, it tells you, okay, you're close. And when you get far away, you're far away. This isn't too useful for a wearable, For a phone, for example, it's really nice. There are actually apps out there on the App Store that, it senses that you're here, and then when you're down here, it knows, that guy just did a repetition. And then up here, and then here, it's another one. So this is a really nice sensor. It does exactly what we want it to do, but for a different case. So nice try. Nope. Then we have rotation sensors. And if you imagine, while you're doing a push-up, there's not much rotation going on. Right? It's maybe not too interesting. So yeah, that's also not interesting for us right now. Where it might be interesting is for a sit-up or something, because then you're like going like that, and then you have some kind of rotation. So maybe it's interesting for other cases, but not the one today. Which leaves us with acceleration, which is kind of what you probably all kind of expected. Like there's some kind of, when you lift your hands up on the ground, slam them back onto the ground, there's like this acceleration happening. So that's the one we're going to focus on. Yep, thumbs up. So there's actually a bunch of acceleration sensors that Android offers us. Yeah, so this is type accelerator. This guy, Matthias Gopian, kind of describes some of the differences. Type accelerometer is basically the raw accelerometer data that you get out of the sensor, which is kind of nice. Raw is good. We don't want it to be too processed, maybe. There's also linear acceleration and gravity, and these are what are called, on most devices, they're going to be fused sensors. So the way it is, Android, or the hardware actually, is combining data from the acceleration sensor and maybe from actually like, I don't know, detecting gravity, who knows what. But it does a little bit of processing and maybe smooths the data out, and then it sends it to you. So you have to kind of play around, see which one you want for this. Gravity, probably not so much. That's not really what you want to measure. But either accelerometer or acceleration could be interesting. Yeah, basically just play with it and see which one gives you the best data. They're always going to give you, it's a vector, so you're always going to get X, Y, and Z. So you have to decide kind of what to do with that. So we have this vector. And if you imagine, if you go back to that image of the push-up, the motion's only happening in one direction. It's kind of always hopping up and down, which is nice. The problem is you don't know what that direction is. Like maybe I'm wearing the watch on my right hand, maybe it's on my left hand, maybe you put it on backwards. So you can't really assume that you know the direction it's going in. But that doesn't really matter because you can kind of assume nothing else is happening, so we'll just go with the magnitude. If it's a big acceleration, good enough. Who cares in what direction? The user's probably not going to do like a push-up and then like swing their arm out to the side. Like it's probably always going to be like this. So those kind of like simplifications are kind of important. Like, it's definitely kind of, it's all heuristic. Like you're always going to be kind of guessing. Yeah, so we're going to ignore the acceleration and just get the magnitude, which is, yeah, math, calculus, we all know that. You just take square root, and you end up with the magnitude of the vector. And if you graph that, you get something that looks like this. Yeah, I think you can see that. So if you look, this was data taken from this watch to doing 10 push-ups. And if you count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? Looks good. So I'd say our job is done here. It's kind of, we have the numbers. We can see, obviously, there's 10 things happening there. If you did 20, there would be 20 stripes. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Just because we can see it doesn't mean it's actually that we're done, right? We still have to count them. That's kind of typical in these artificial intelligence problems. Like you looked at them as a person with real intelligence, and you say, obviously, 10 things happen there. Obviously, this is a push-up. But the computer, that's the whole point of it, is thinking up these algorithms that can determine what a repetition is. Yeah, and there are obviously well-known algorithms for that. The Google buzzword that you should try putting in is online peak detection algorithm, because the way it is online, because we want it to count as we get the data. Peak detection is kind of what this is. You're trying to detect when it stops going up and starts going down, for some definition of up and down. Yeah, so if you Google for that, you'll find tons of algorithms. And I found one that seemed to be pretty decent for this problem. It's always going to be different algorithms for different problems. And this particular algorithm is called peak det. And they have like this little capsule description of it. So a point is considered a maximum peak if it has the maximum value and was preceded to the left by a value lower than delta, whatever delta is. We'll just ignore that for now. But what that's saying is, if you're at a max and to the left there was something that was low, then you're at a max. Then you found your peak. And if you keep on going, maybe you find another max. And the algorithm's more complicated than that. I'm not going to go into any pseudocode or real code for this algorithm. You can look it up and implement it and all that if you want. But if you kind of pump our data into this algorithm, it spits out repetitions, which is basically what we saw before, right? It's spitting out these stripes at the bottom are the recognized peaks from that. So perfect, it's looking good. And for this case, we had a delta of 40. Sounds like a good value. Hopefully it's always good. It won't be. And you can kind of see where that happens. Like here it started at 10, 9.8, gravity, and it went up to 60. And 60 is obviously more than 40 above 10. So that's where that delta comes in. If you have kind of like a really weak push, like this weak little bump that you make, your peaks aren't going to be as high, and you're going to need a lower delta. For example, here, if you have the same size of the peaks but a lower delta, it's going to recognize a lot more. It recognized like 20 there in that case. So that's kind of the downside of this delta parameter. What are you going to do? That's kind of the benefits of peak debt. It's online, so it's just eating away at your data. It's efficient. We saw if we can kind of calculate the complexity, you have to get the magnitude of the vector. So that's 3 square operations, a square root, and then a couple like greater than, less thans. So it's really not that bad for efficiency. And the biggest downside for this is the sensitivity to the delta parameter. And what you could do to get around that is maybe have like a calibration step. Ask your user, do 5 pushups, and when it can recognize 5 pushups from the data, then you kind of know this is a good delta parameter for this user. So that would be kind of like a pre-calibration step, and hopefully it would be good for this user for the rest of the time. So battery efficiency. So obviously, if you're doing all this on the watch, you don't want it to stop working anytime soon. You don't want to chew through your battery in 10 push-ups. So what can we do to do that? These first 4 points I'm going to go into in more depth in a bit. But I added this one yesterday because yesterday morning there was this power optimization talk from a guy named Xavier. It was a good talk. He mentioned some of the things I'm going to talk about here. It's probably worth going on to YouTube and watching it if this is your kind of thing. So battery efficiency. What you can do, you can analyze fewer samples. So for all those graphs initially, I was doing it, when you register your sensors, when you register for sensor updates, you can tell it how often do you want to have updates, like how much data do you want. I did all mine with this sensor delay fastest, which has infinite speed, which basically means it doesn't put in any delay. Because how Android implements this is it reads a value from the sensor, and then it either keeps going and just keeps reading and reading and reading and reading. That's the fastest one. Or for the sensor delay game, it waits 50 hertz, so like 20 milliseconds or something. It waits and then reads the next value. And then it waits and reads the next value. So this is kind of like an artificial delay that Android introduces. And you can say, either one, as much data as you can give me, or maybe not as much. So all of those graphs were done with fastest. I also tested the same thing with game and UI delay, and it was for push-ups it worked. Who knows if maybe for sit-ups, if it would be not enough. So it's another kind of like tuning value. You have to see, if somebody's doing really slow push-ups, maybe you need really high resolution to get that, or the other way around. But in any case, so you have to kind of play with that to see how it treats your battery. Yeah, so in addition to those 4 constants, you also have the ability to say, I want to get my data at exactly 27 hertz. And you give that to Android, and Android says, no. Like, it's kind of a suggestion to the device. So if that's really important for you, you can try it. But I think in general, those 4 constants are enough. So yeah, so you can analyze more or less samples. That's good. You can do less analysis per sample. So this comes down to like that algorithm selection. We saw that peak det was a relatively efficient algorithm. It didn't have any crazy functions like cosines or crazy powers or anything like that. Because this peak detection stuff, it gets as complicated as you want, kind of. You can do Gaussian matching and stuff to get how big. You don't need it for these cases, you don't need that kind of stuff. And especially for a watch, it's probably not that important. Or for a watch, the efficiency is probably more important than having it be exactly correct. If you do one more repetition because you missed one, that's probably okay. At least your watch is still, at least you still have battery power. Yeah. Another option, so I wrote a sample app for this. That's where all that data came from. It runs purely on the Android Wear watch, which is a nice benefit we have over our iPhone friends, iOS friends. So it all runs here. You could theoretically send the data to a phone, have the phone crunch through the data, and then send it back to the watch, and have the watch be like, okay, that was a rep. It's a question of whether the data transfer is maybe more expensive than actually processing it on the watch itself. But maybe not. Maybe it is a good idea for you. Yeah, and we can choose less power-hungry sensors. Like I said, there are these fused sensors that kind of incorporate a couple different sensors into one. Maybe they take more power. Who knows? It's also something I have to play with. Xavier mentioned yesterday that the gyroscope sensor is a pretty power-hungry sensor. So maybe that's one that you would want to avoid for a case like this. And it's nice, the sensor actually has an API that you can ask it how much power are you going to use when I put you in use. So maybe you could actually decide it dynamically. So if you know you have 2 algorithms, or you have an algorithm that can work with input from 2 different sensors, and you want to choose the most efficient one, you can say, how much power are you going to take if I use you, and how much power are you going to take, and maybe choose dynamically. Yeah. And that's actually all I have. I do have the watch, this algorithm, or this sample app on the watch, so if you want to come by after the talk and do some push-ups, and actually have it count for you, feel free. I was going to offer to do some here. Everybody convinced me not to, so that's good. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.